I know it's rather late, but here are your notes on sustainable agriculture. So, one of the major goals of sustainable agriculture is to conserve soil. This especially became important after the Dust Bowl when there was so much soil erosion happening. So, that's the major goal of soil conservation. So, some of the methods of farming that can be used to preserve soil are contour plowing. This is where you have a sloped area, and instead of trying to say, plow your lines straight down the slope, instead of doing that, you plow your lines around the slope. And that is not what I meant to do. Let's erase that because that is not how it should look. All right, so you basically plow your lines or plow your furrows so that way they're all at the same elevation. What's the point of this? Well, a few things. One, you have these plow lines that are basically going to serve as water breaks to help prevent water from flowing as fast down the slope, and that's also going to increase infiltration. But another thing, it reduces the erosion of soil being carried by water or wind down the slope. So they're level furrows that curve around the land. And a lot of times it's used in concert with another technique that we're going to talk about in a moment called strip cropping. It's something that's similar to contour plowing, but not quite the same as terracing. So instead of kind of leaving the slope intact and just kind of plowing around it, instead you shape the land so that instead of having a constant slope, you're making kind of this stair step pattern. And that allows for agriculture to happen on land that would otherwise be too steep. So you create these terraces. And these terraces are used in a lot of places. From some of what I saw, it seems that they may have been first used by the Inca in Peru, but it's also very common nowadays to use terracing in Asia to grow rice. One of the things that happens is when you kind of build these barriers at the end of the terrace, that allows you to retain water, and that allows you to grow these kind of water intensive crops like rice that you otherwise wouldn't be able to grow in that area. And then each terrace also channels water to the next. Since each terrace is level, that's going to decrease soil erosion. So that's another way to conserve soil. Another thing that happens is since you're not going to have, severe runoff just kind of carrying all the water away, that's going to decrease the leaching of nutrients where water flows through soil, dissolves nutrients, and carries them away as runoff because you are lowering the rate of runoff. Okay. But I said they're similar, so what's the difference between the two? It's mostly in part of it's in how the water's managed. So contour plowing basically controls water by cutting those furrows or those rows into the soil, while terrace farming controls water by creating those level platforms. Another thing, if you look at the surface of a hill that's been farmed with contour plowing, it might look like this where you've got like these furrows. So that would be a furrow, kind of small dips. Whereas with terracing, you're making the land flat. So each of these is a terrace where you can grow some crops and they're level. Another way to decrease soil erosion is to create windbreaks, otherwise known as shelter belts. And this is where you plant a line of trees or shrubs, something taller than your crops that's going to slow down wind. One of the huge problems in the Dust Bowl was the fact that it was the Great Plains, vast open stretch of land with no windbreaks. Wind speeds would rise and then carry away topsoil. And so after that, using windbreaks became very common. It slows down the wind. It also redirects the wind so that way you don't have an area that's going to have high levels of soil erosion. Then, if you are not planting any sort of, fruit trees or anything like that that you can harvest, you can plant trees that will provide some natural ecosystem services, like supporting some habitats for wildlife, which increases your biodiversity. If you're growing trees, those sequester or store more carbon, and that can also create habitats for pollinators and pest control species. And these are commonly planted in these structures called hedgerows, which are around the edges of a field. Another way to conserve crops, a lot of the crops that we grow, corn, wheat, rice, they are annuals. And that means you have to replant, you basically save the seeds and then replant every year. That means that whenever you are in between harvest and sowing, that land could potentially be exposed to wind erosion, water erosion, etc. And also, um, you basically have to replant every year, which means the plant has to grow from scratch. So most of its energy is creating stems, creating leaves, getting able to photosynthesize. On the other hand, there are perennial crops which can live for many years and don't need to be replanted. So you harvest and then you leave the plants alive and then you just let it, go through the next season and then you harvest the next year. So a lot of fruit trees are like this. I have in my yard a fig tree that I harvest from every fall. Oil palms, berries. So if you grow like raspberries or blackberries, those bushes live for multiple years. Asparagus, rhubarb, chives, mint. I have mint that grows in my yard that actually has been alive for probably a good 8 years. And then oregano and kale as well. What are some of the benefits? Well, since these plants and their soil retaining root systems are staying in place year round, that's going to decrease erosion. It's also going to make your irrigation more efficient because the crops tend to have these more widespread or deeper root systems that they can grow over multiple years. So they're going to hold on to moisture in the soil more efficiently. They can also take up some excess nutrients, which would reduce eutrophication downstream and filter out some pollutants. Another thing, since they have these wide, extensive root systems, they can take up nutrients more efficiently, which can reduce your need for fertilizer, which also reduces like eutrophication. And then when they're creating these very intricate root systems, they can sequester or store carbon in the soil, which means less of it is going into the air. This is very good for crops that naturally have a lifespan greater than a year, but a lot of our grains and things like that we grow for food are annual crops. So scientists are working on some selective breeding, maybe some genetic engineering to try and convert annual crops to perennial crops or find perennial alternatives for what are our traditional annual crops. Another method is no-till agriculture. We've talked about tilling a little bit. Tilling is basically turning over the soil, and that will leave the soil exposed and breaks up root systems, so that way erosion is a lot easier. Instead, you can do a few things. You can leave behind the crop residues, so the body of the plant minus whatever you harvested and leave that behind and then just insert seeds using seed drills or digging tiny holes. There are a couple of different techniques. Sod seeding, you have whatever was um, growing over the earth, you kill it with herbicide so it makes something called sod, which is just a layer of mostly dead plants, and then you sow under that. So any fertilizer you apply, any water that you apply isn't going to get absorbed by another plant. Instead, it's going to be absorbed by. I mean, it's just going to be sitting there with the kind of dead, decaying remains of the plants that are still there. And there's also direct seeding, which is when you harvest, you don't take out the bodies of the plants, you leave them there, and then you just kind of sow underneath that. What are some of the benefits? Well, it's going to decrease erosion, especially in the areas where the soil is going to be more likely to be eroded, some things like sandy soil, which doesn't retain moisture very well, or soils on slopes, which also erode very easily. It increases water infiltration. That kind of dead plant matter um, helps hold on to water in the area. It's very similar to mulching. So if you or your family use mulch, you put it around the base of plants. It helps prevent some weed growth because it's blocking those seeds, whatever that might fall, access to the ground. And also it helps retain moisture. So some people will like, for example, rake up leaves in the fall, and they'll take that and they'll spread it around the base of, trees or other plants, and then that helps to retain moisture. And also, when those things decay, that improves nutrient cycling. So you have to apply less fertilizer because as it decays, it's releasing stuff as fertilizer. Strip cropping is very similar to something we've already talked about, intercropping. You're going to plant strips of crops, and then you're going to move them around basically in a crop rotation pattern. So if you look at this bottom diagram, on this first year, you're growing soybeans, right? The next year, you're going to grow in that place corn instead. Um, the layer where you were growing corn in year one, you're going to switch over to oats then. And so you're utilizing all of your land at the same time. It's like crop rotation, or you can use crop rotation with it. So that way you have different plants with different nutrient needs. So, for example, the soybeans would be their legumes, so they're going to have nitrogen fixing bacteria and add nitrogen to the soil. And that would be why you do the rotating. This can be used on sloped lands to help control soil erosion. And like I said, it's very similar to intercropping. What are the benefits? Reducing erosion. You can choose plants that help each other or that provide something beneficial to another plant. For example, legumes are a very common choice for that. It can improve water infiltration and retention of soil. And also, it can attract pollinators and control pests because you're basically doing something that is not a monoculture. And those interruptions in space, it's harder for example, a corn pest to move from here to here. And so it's harder for it to spread. So you have diseases and pests spread less easily. What are some strategies to improve soil fertility? This is talking about beyond any sort of soil erosion and soil conservation. Well, obviously, we've talked about crop rotation before. There are a few other things. You can add something called green manure, which is not actually green poop. Instead, you grow plants in an area, and then you while they're still green, while they're still alive, plow them or turn them over into the soil, and then as they decompose, they add organic matter to the soil. Or if you grow a legume crop, that's going to add nitrogen to the soil. Another thing you can do is add limestone, sometimes called agricultural lime. It's basically crushed limestone rock, and what it does is it makes the soil less acidic. So some crops are going to have their kind of favored conditions. They'll have a certain pH range in which they grow best. If the soil gets too acidic and those plants won't grow anymore, you can just add some limestone. Limestone also adds calcium and magnesium to the soil. These are some micronutrients that are needed in small amounts by living things. Improves water retention. Those ions that are in the soil can attract some water and keep it around. And it also helps plants absorb other nutrients that you can put in fertilizer, like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It helps them absorb that better, which can reduce your need for other fertilizer. Then this is kind of the boundary between like agriculture and meat production. But what you can do is you can, instead of just doing like crop rotation, you can rotate livestock in there. So you could have, for example, one year grow beans, the next year grow oats, the next year leave it as grass. So that way you can raise some cattle there. Another thing, you can also have a pasture land that you divide up into sections, and you basically move the cows from one area to another as time passes. So they might spend, a month here and then a month here. And then as they move through all the different pastures, everywhere where they're not, the grass is able to regrow. And the good part of that is, you can actually overgraze grass, and that's something that's going to come up on the meat production notes. All right, that is it.